As a kid, I loved the game of basketball. And my favorite basketball player in the whole world as a kid was a man by the name of Julius Erving. Dr. J is what they called him. Now, my love for him had really nothing to do with what I knew about his life or character or anything like that. I just loved to watch the man play basketball. I remember leaping off of my couch and shouting when I see him make a steal against the Lakers and he heads down the left side of the court in one of the most iconic dunks in all of NBA history. He rocks the baby and then puts it to sleep. Beautiful. I watch him behind the backboard. He leaps and scoops from one side to the other. It felt like he stayed in the air forever. I loved watching Dr. J play basketball because he moved with grace. With grace. So think about the Olympics. Y'all ready for the Olympics? Ready or not, here they come. I think they start this week. My wife and I love watching that kind of competition. So I think about a guy like Michael Phelps, right? The most decorated Olympian of all time. He's retired now, but my goodness, when you watched Michael Phelps move in the water, it was power and grace. Or how about Simone Biles, right? She's still in. She's the most decorated American gymnast ever. She is 4'8" tall. But when she does a floor routine, she reaches heights of 12 feet in the air and then can land it with precision. You watch her move and it is grace. Back in the old days, like the 90s, there was this runner by the name of Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson, he was the only man to ever win the 200 and the 400 in the same Olympics, and then the only man to repeat the 400 in the next Olympics. Now, I know this might surprise you, but running is not my passion. It is not. It is nowhere near the top of the list of passions in my life. I don't like running. I don't watch running, but I'm telling you, when Michael Johnson ran, I watched. Because the man ran with grace. When you hear the word grace outside of the church, it is typically that definition. Grace is an elegance or beauty of form, manner, motion, or action. It is an elegance as you swim or as you jump or as you run. But when we think about the word grace inside the world of faith, inside the church, a word that we use often, it has a different definition. The definition of grace when we think about theology is unmerited favor, meaning undeserved favor of God. What God has done for us that we do not deserve, that while we were sinners, Christ would die for us. Now, when you look at this word, grace, and yet the definitions, it appears to be two different meanings. But today, I want us to see, I believe they are much more connected than we often realize. Because people who live by grace, people who live in the undeserved favor of God, live more beautiful lives. People who live within a grace that we do not deserve but has been poured out of, people who live in that grace live more elegant lives. And what I mean by that is not harsh, not sharp, but with forgiveness and care and compassion and kindness. I mean, why not just hold a grudge against those who have hurt you? Well, because bitterness is not a beautiful life. Unforgiveness is not a beautiful life. So, today, as we continue our study series called The Genius of Jesus. Today we are digging into his genius of grace. Yes, unmerited favor and an elegance in how he approaches those who need it. We see this message of grace really, woven throughout all of Scripture, obviously, in the real life stories. And by real life stories, I mean like the moment that Jesus calls the tax man Matthew. He calls him to follow. And then the next thing you know, it says Jesus is at a dinner with a bunch of other tax collectors and sinners. And I've told you this before. It's because tax collectors in that day were considered traitors. So the only friends they had were other tax collectors. So suddenly Jesus at this dinner, and the Pharisees asked Jesus the question, why do you want to go to dinner with tax collectors and sinners? And this is how Jesus answers their question. In Matthew chapter 9, on hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. In other words, not those who think they have it all together, but for those who know they don't have it all together. Grace. Grace. And then, even in the stories that we call parables in the Bible, those are stories that Jesus constructs in order to teach us about the kingdom of God, like the prodigal. The parable of the prodigal. We've been studying that from time to time all year long. And I'm reminding you today, when the prodigal decides that he wants to go back home, right? He's in the pig pen. And what does he say? Does he say, Dad, I've messed up. Will you forgive me and let me back into the family? No, that's not what he says. Look what he says in Luke 15. He says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Now, why does Jesus tell the story like that? It's because Jesus knows his audience. And what his audience is fully aware of is law. They knew what the law demanded, and when you messed up, there were consequences to that. In other words, Jesus tells the story of the son. He only knows to respond what he thinks he deserves. He doesn't even make a plea for grace. The gospel writer John says these words about Jesus. John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word, that's Jesus, became flesh, right? He puts on skin. And he made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. Here we go. Full of grace and truth. Now, if you never heard this before, full of grace and truth does not mean 50% grace and 50% truth. It means full of grace and truth. All grace, all truth. And I want to make it clear. When it comes to Heart of Life, we are in the both and camp. Both grace and truth. And the reason I say that is because of something I have learned when we get to days like today where we start really diving into the deep end of grace and realizing how amazing, how magnificent that my standing with God, come on, it has nothing to do with what I have done. It is not according to what I deserve, what I have earned. It has nothing to do with that. It's his grace. The question that tends to then be posed to me is, well, Jeff, wait a minute. So what are you saying now? Because of God's grace, then it doesn't matter what we do? Or are you saying now that because we're covered by his grace, we can just live however we want? No, I'm not saying that. And in 24 years of being your pastor, I've never said that. Nor does anything in the Bible say that. I think it is amazing that we suddenly start to wrestle when we dive deep into grace. And I think it's what the people who saw Jesus in the flesh back in the day, wrestled with the most when they saw him too. What distinguished him was the grace that they saw. When God puts on skin and walks among them, it was a grace that they had never before really understood or seen. And you've got religious leaders in that day who are operating in the law. They still see the law as a platform to hold people accountable, which, let me translate that, it means they could judge other people. And in a way, they could hold them hostage by the law because nobody could keep it all. So here's the story. One day, Jesus is in the temple courts. He's in the temple courts and people are gathering and he's teaching. And John tells us something happens that goes like this. John chapter 8, verse 3. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" Here's John tells us, they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. John says, let me just add a little commentary here. It was a trap. It was a trap. And when you see everything that's going on here, you know it's a trap. Why would they want to trap him? Because the religious leaders do not appreciate the fact that Jesus regularly will call them out on their hypocritical judgment. They do not appreciate. And so if they can trap him and make it look like Jesus doesn't follow the law of God, then they can turn the people against him and they're better. The heartbreaking piece to me is that in order to set the trap, they had to use a woman. And when I say use, it's like my mind just goes to how far did they set her up for this? Did they really just find her, or was the whole thing a manipulation and a setup? I don't have a hard time imagining as they drag her not just in front of Jesus, but in front of a crowd. The embarrassment, the shame. And where's the man, by the way? Where's the man? He's guilty too, right? So you put all that together, and it's why John says, it's a trap. This is obvious. It's a trap. Watch what happens. But Jesus bent down, starts to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightens back up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Now, I'm not downplaying this event as though it were a game. It is not a game, especially for the woman who stands there that day. But when I read this scene, and I play it in my head, for me, the analogy is like when I watch Jesus, it's like watching a great athlete that owns the floor. All right, so if you like sports at all, if you've ever, there are moments you're watching a game unfold, and when you watch it all come together in your mind, you know the one on that court or the one on that field who's in charge. You know the one who owns the floor. And in this scene, Jesus owns it. And he operates with an elegance. He moves with intention. You see him riding on the ground. He wastes no movement. He wastes no words. It takes some time because as he's riding, it says that they're continuing to accuse. They're trying to get him to take action. And then finally, when he stands and he just gives one simple statement, and he's like, okay, anybody here never sinned? You get this started. Take your shot. And I wonder how long after he said that it was silent. Silent. And then you begin to hear the thump of stones as they were released from the hands of people and they hit the ground. It says from the oldest to the youngest, literally, Jesus clears the court. Verse 10. Jesus straightened up and asked her. He stands up and asked her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. I want to make just a few observations here in terms of how I see Jesus go at this. She experiences grace as Jesus chooses to see beyond, and you could insert the word, her immediate consequences or circumstances, her immediate circumstances. In other words, I think it is often the case when we tend to see somebody who's guilty, our first thought is the bad decisions they have made that got them here. The bad decisions that have been made that got them here. And it's as though Jesus, in this moment, he's fully aware of that. He's not overlooking, but to be able to look beyond the immediate decisions that have been made and to be able to look beyond what everybody else wants to see happen to her. What a message for our world when suddenly, right, it can feel like the whole world has decided to gang up against what, but he's able to see the moment, but not just the moment. Somehow he's able to see the brokenness behind all of that. And what did he say in Matthew? It's the sick that need a doctor. It's not the ones who think they have it all together. It's those who know they don't. And with eyes of grace, Jesus sees a woman that he loves enough to die for. That he loves enough to die for. This story, I believe, it is a picture of grace like they have never seen before. A holy God declaring, I don't condemn you. And not because she did anything to deserve it, right? Many of us are familiar with John 3:16 about a God who so loves the world that he gave his son, right? But do you know what 17 says? 17 says God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. She experiences grace as Jesus chooses to see beyond her immediate circumstances. Don't translate that as ignore, but he can see the bigger picture. Second, she experiences grace as Jesus speaks to her future. Anybody condemn you? No, sir. No one condemns me. Me either. Now go and do whatever you want. No. Go and what? Sin no more. As in, okay, from this moment on, where you're walking forward is going to look different than where you have walked in the past. Your future can look very different than your past. He speaks to her about walking forward, leaving a life of sin. If you receive the grace of God, your future doesn't look like your past. He sees beyond the brief moment. He sees the bigger picture. It's like Jesus can see the before and the after. And if you are a follower of Jesus, if you are really a Christian, it's because he saw you the same way. And yes, he told you the truth about who you are and about who he is, but he also met you with grace. And he didn't define you by the bad decisions that you have made. He saw you in your brokenness, and when he saw you, he saw someone worth dying for. He is the God who does not give us what we deserve. He actually gave Jesus what we deserve. And he gave us what Jesus deserves. So when you and I remember where we came from before we met Jesus, and then we are reminded on a regular basis that, come on, we still make mistakes, and we're not where we want to be in the sense of we've still got a long way to go. When we realize who we've been and we realize that the distance that we have to go, come on, it enables us to live with grace. We know we need grace, not just at a moment of salvation, but every day. It is a grace for every day. Receiving God's grace leads to living God's grace. We'll say it again. Receiving God's grace leads to living God's grace. What has been extended to you, you will extend to others. So here's come on, we got to evaluate. So do we? Like, do we extend the grace of God to others? Do we choose, when we see people in predicaments, people who are in times of consequence, maybe do we only see the bad decisions that they have made? And come on, I'm not saying don't see that, but is that all we see? Do we see beyond how everybody else chooses to evaluate them? Do we see them broken? Do we extend grace to others? Do we choose to speak to their future, not just seeing who they've been, but what the power of the grace of God can make them to be? Do we extend grace that way? So I want to do something. I want you to think about something. You don't have to say it. In fact, I prefer that you don't, all right? Don't say it out loud. What is the sin that you might see in others that like angers you the most? You know what I'm talking about? Like we kind of all have some top sins. Like we're willing to admit they're all sins, but we each kind of have some sins that when we see somebody do such and such, it just tends to rise an anger in us. And then here's what I want you to consider. All right, you got it. You might even have a face now, all right? What if God doesn't need you to judge them? What if he's already got that covered? Like, what if he doesn't need you to judge them? And are you seriously going to be the first to throw the stone? What if God's not looking for somebody to judge them, but he's looking for somebody alongside him to love them? Like, come on. does not mean to close your eyes to the truth. Does not mean you are in any way playing down sin. It doesn't ignore the truth. It doesn't ignore sin. But grace does lead with an elegance. So let's get practical with this. Do you see how this might bless your marriage if you decided, hey, I'm going to extend grace to my spouse? Because sometimes grace needs to be extended, right? You know those moments when this person who is supposed to be your closest ally suddenly feels like your enemy? And the reason they feel like the enemy is because, let's just hypothetical here, one of you took a verbal swing for whatever reason. You took a verbal swing, and instead of in that moment deciding, let's go with grace, you said, nah, let's play the reciprocal game. And so when a verbal swing came, a verbal swing was returned. And we'll go eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, right? Before you know it, it is turned into, because this seems to be retro sports reference day, it is turned into a rumble in the jungle, all right? Anybody old enough to remember a rumble in the jungle? All right, yeah. In this moment, you want to be Muhammad Ali because he wins the rumble in the jungle long time ago. And you are convinced there is a win if you can show yourself to be more powerful than the other. And it's in this moment we forget how God's grace met us. So we start to think about some lies. The lies go like this: I don't want to extend grace because he's being a jerk and it's not fair for him to get off that easy, right? Or lies like, I've got to stand my ground because she's got to learn this lesson. Or, hey, I'll extend grace, but I want to hear some level of an apology. All right, let's think about that. You're right. It's not fair for him or her to act the way they are. It's not fair to get off that easy, right? But can I tell you that Jesus already paid the price for that? He paid the price for that. The question is not who are they to be forgiven. The question is, who am I to withhold that forgiveness? I know we think we need to sometimes stand our ground to teach a lesson, but when we look at the truth of Scripture, Titus chapter 2 tells us that it's the grace of God that trains us to stop sinning. And Romans chapter 2 tells us it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. It's grace. And yeah, I know we would prefer to not extend any grace until an apology came, but can I remind you that at that moment, it's no longer grace? Because it just became something you feel was deserved. Grace is undeserved favor. It is unmerited favor. Grace flows from a bloody cross. So what can you do? What do you do in your marriage when, come on, you know there are moments of tension that happen. I would encourage you, make your plan in peacetime. Make your plan when there's peace. And sit down together and pray and say, God, help us know how to handle these moments. How can we communicate better? One of the questions to ask your spouse is, do you prefer to handle this immediately or take a little time? Because once you kind of figure that out, he may be different than you. You can act accordingly, that sometimes it's in the moment, sometimes you got to give a little time. Instead of escalating the issue, what you want to do is learn how to draw in the sand. What I love about that scene in John chapter 8 is Jesus, in a sense, takes hold of the moment. And in all the chaos that's going on around him, and people are shouting what should happen to her, and there she is in embarrassment and all that's happening, it's like he slows down the moment. He writes in the sand for a period of time because they're, again, still accusing. It says while he's writing, and then when he's ready to speak, his words are minimal. Nothing wasted there. How can you learn to write in the sand in those moments when instead of escalating and as one voice goes loud, the other voice begins to get loud? How do you write in the sand? One of the things, this is going to sound crazy, but crazy, grace is crazy. When you feel yourself in those tension moments, give each other permission that either one of you can just declare at any moment, I need you to speak affection to me. In other words, you can do it like this. Make an agreement that when you're in the fight, either one of you can choose at any moment to just say, I need you to tell me you love me. And I know you got to make the agreement in the moment that you got to do it. You got to do it. You got to say you love me, and then the person that it's said to returns the statement. Now, for one, it'll break up a few arguments just because you start laughing at each other in the middle of the fight. But it's the point. It's the point because so many times what we're arguing over does not have any eternal value whatsoever. We have just gotten caught up in a selfish moment. And you're just reminding each other in the moment, you really do love each other. You know how to speak words of affection. You do it at times. But in a fight, it's weird how those words tend to get stuck in our throat. So make the deal in the middle of it. You can just turn, and whoever goes first gets to go first. It's just the deal. Whoever gets to go first says, I need you to tell me that you love me. They say, I love you, and then you say, I love you too. And then go ahead and go back to fighting after that. It'll slow you down. It'll slow you down. And if it doesn't, then it's probably time to take like some more even bigger steps of trying to figure out what's really going on in our hearts. Like if that doesn't slow you down, there's probably something more significant that needs to be worked through. So fight for it. Fight for it. Do you see how this can bless your parenting? If you extend grace to your children. Man, you have powerful opportunities to teach your children. Some of them, it's because they have a ringside view to the fight that just went on. And I know some people have the opinion, don't ever let your kids see you fight. I'm like, I think you can let your kids see you fight as long as they see you fight with grace and truth. If they watch you model what I just described earlier, then you are teaching them something about how to respond with grace. To those of you who have children, many of you with small children, y'all, I got to tell you, I feel like a giant dad and grandpa at times when I look across Heart of Life body and I watch parents loving their kids. So many of you are doing such a phenomenal job. You are. I did not say that you get it all right, because none of us ever got it all right. But you love them. And your heart is intentional. You are, and I just want to tell you how absolutely proud I am of so many of you and how you are taking the parenting role and how you see the value of that. And I'm just reminding you, sometimes they're going to get things right and sometimes they're going to get things wrong. Your goal is not just to teach them right and wrong. It is also to teach them they are fully loved, even when they don't get it right. I know you want them to behave. Keep doing that. But you also want to capture their heart. You want to capture their heart. So one of the practical things you might consider doing is, and some of you maybe already do this, but maybe some of you want to ratchet up a little bit. Come on, it's real easy to focus on what they've done wrong because they're like the rest of us. They do wrong on a daily basis. But along with having to deal with the wrong, decide that every day you're going to spend a little time speaking to them of how beautiful you can see their future can be when the grace of God is at work in their hearts. I don't mean you got to spend an hour every day doing that. I just mean look for opportunities to remind them the potential of God's grace at work in their life. And just like Jesus did for that lady, hey, your future is better than where you've been. Remind them. You can overpower anybody smaller than you to do whatever you want. But what we saw last week is that's not real power. Real power is to be able to love them with the grace of God that leads to repentance. How do we do that? Let me show you a few verses. This is where I think grace is absolutely amazing. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 says, "And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work." Okay, wait a minute. That sounds really cool, but I thought grace was it's God's nature of leaning toward us, his unmerited favor. This sounds like grace is like a force, like it's a power. It is. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he clarifies, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my" what? "Power is made perfect in weakness." Can I give you really, really good news? I mean, it is already magnificent, the fact that grace is unmerited favor. But grace is not just unmerited favor. Grace is also enabling power. It is enabling power. So when we read, right? We read these truths, we realize, okay, this is not only a disposition or a quality in the nature of God, this is also a God acting. This is a God whose grace is extended to us, but it is also an empowering that is practical, that those of us who have received grace are able to extend grace. In Hebrews chapter 4, there's a verse you're very familiar with. "Let us then approach God's throne of" what? "Grace." Meaning, here's the realm where God, he always treats us better than we deserve. He is the God who loves us even though we have not earned or merited such love. But watch, "so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us." It is not just that his grace receives us, it is also that his grace empowers us. God's grace is both his divine heart to treat us better than we deserve, and it is the extension of that to help us in all that he calls us to do, like loving our spouse and loving our kids and loving this world. Because by God's grace, we have been given the power to engage a messed up world. But we are not going to get that done with judgment and shouting about how bad they are. Like Jesus, there's supposed to be grace. Grace. I think if you and I can begin to see beyond the surface circumstances of all that's going on in our world, we begin to realize that much of that has to do with the way people try to do life. And the way most people try to do life is what I would call a moral performance story. Their story is, I can be valuable if I can achieve. I can be valuable if I can accomplish. And do you realize how insecure that can become? I mean, because not everything seems to work, and there's this clamoring. And like when it's tied to your value, then you're willing to step over the top of somebody else to get that. When it's tied to your significance, you're willing to do whatever needs to be done in order to have that. And so here's what happens when you operate with a moral performance story. Let's say that your heart is to work for the poor, you're for human rights, you're one of those people who say, you're very open-minded. If you operate with a moral performance story, you cannot help but feel superior to those who are bigots. You can't help it. But let's move inside the church. That maybe it's you go to church, you read your Bible, maybe you even do things to serve God, if you will. But if you're really operating from a moral performance story where you believe it's what you achieve that makes you significant and valuable, you will have a tendency, you almost can't help it, you will think that you are better than those who don't believe like you believe. And you can play this in any way. If you're a hardworking person, then you think you're superior to those who are lazy. If this is your story, and it's about clamoring for achievement and success, but I want you to know there's a different story. It's called the gospel story. It is the good news of Jesus, and it is a grace story. And here's what grace says: I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. And I got no business judging others because I can't even live up to my own standards. I fail. But Jesus died for those who know they don't have it all together, like me. Therefore, I am not superior to anybody else. I am a sinner that is saved by the grace of God, and I am valuable. I am significant, but it's because Jesus died for me, He claims me, and He loves me. And when that happens in my life, no longer is my self-image determined by my achievements or my performance, right? That whole insecure process, like what's good enough? How good do I have to be? I got to be better than you. And that whole battle. No, when I live a grace story, it's the end of a life of suspicion. I don't have to make sure that nobody else is getting ahead of me. I'm not comparing myself to anybody else. It changes, one, your motivation, why you do what you do. Because come on, if you're living a moral performance story, which is to live under the law, like you got to keep it. You got to keep all the rules. You got to. Then you are trying to earn your acceptance with God by achievement, but under grace, you are trusting Jesus for your acceptance and His performance, that then whatever you do out of that is because you love. It changes the power question. Like, how do you do what you do? It changes it from I've got to figure out how to make it through this scenario, this life, this hurt, to under grace. A grace story, a person lives by the life and the power of Jesus. If you and I can begin to see all the craziness that is going on in our world that is tied to just the selfishness and arrogance, and if we can begin to see like beyond even immediate circumstances to the broken underneath, then can we start to walk this out in a different way than judgment and harshness? I'm gonna go ahead and ask the band if they want to come on up while I tell you just this last little story, okay? There was a time in my life that I was angry, we could say disgusted, with the church. I don't mean this one, I mean the one that I was at that time in my life. I was I was late teens, early 20. But it was then that I encountered some people who claimed to be Jesus followers, but they left me and some people I love very much wounded. And what happened was, suddenly I found out that many of the people that I called my church at that time, I wasn't a pastor, I was a part of it, they didn't see all people as valuable to God. Like suddenly, I find this out. They saw themselves superior to others, and a part of that included if the color of their skin was different. I had no idea. I was absolutely shocked at the arrogance and the judgmental I never expected it from this group of people that I gathered with every Sunday, where together we sang Amazing Grace. And we sang all the verses. They were church people. Like most of them didn't just attend church, they would attend Bible study. They were Bible study teachers. Like they were the people that like taught me as I'm growing up. And I remember even as a young man at that point going, what are they gonna do? Go to church more? They already go to church. They already read the Bible. It's like they don't need more of that. They need real Christianity. They need Jesus. And I'm declaring to you that by God's grace, I was able to see that is not Jesus. And by God's grace, I did not walk away from him or the church as a whole. Now, I'm declaring this by God's grace because as a pastor, over these years, I have watched story after story where I've seen people encounter such moments of hurt and pain, and they walked away. I'm declaring to you by God's grace, I did not walk away. But every once in a while, I retell this story, my story of experiencing an absence of grace where grace should be most present. And I tell it because I want you to know, you're sitting out there, those of you watching online, there may be some of you who have experienced a similar thing where there was a day you walked out of the church more wounded than you were when you walked in. And today I'm encouraging you to not walk away from Jesus. And to believe me when I tell you that not all of his people are hypocritical in that way. In fact, many of them really do love by his grace. They see you as valuable, period, because Jesus sees you as valuable, period. I'll admit to you that for a while, that messed me up. It messed me up. Like these are people that you know how that stuff happens in your life where things that you think are rock solid and they're not. For a little while, I was bitter over that deal. I really was. But here's the shocker. God's grace wouldn't let me stay there, right? Why not just hold a grudge? Because a life of bitterness, that's not real Christianity either. God healed my heart. I want you to know today that you really are valuable. You are valuable in the sight of a God who is willing to die for you. And therefore, I promise you, this room is filled with people who also believe you are valuable. Come on, I want you to know a God who treats you not like you deserve, but a God who wants to claim you as his, to love you, to forgive. Church, by God's grace, we have been given the power to engage a messed up world. We are not going to do that in judgment and shouts of how bad they are. The world needs to see us live real Christianity. And the good news, you ready for some good news? We'll end it on good news. His grace is enough.